We start the day in St Petersburg, where 2 days of talks between Russian and African leaders have drawn to a close. Russia's prepared to supply African countries with weapons, some of them for free, and work more closely with intelligence agencies on the continent. President Vladimir Putin also thanked African nations for a peace initiative launched by African leaders at the summit aimed at ending the war in Ukraine. Well, the African leaders who took part at the summit have not condemned Russia for invading Ukraine, but their calls for an end to the war and a renewal of grain exports from Ukraine were more forceful than they've been in the past.
This war must end, and it can only end on the basis of justice and reason. The disruption it is causing to energy and grain supplies must end immediately. The agreement on grains must be extended for the benefit of all the peoples of the world and Africans in particular.
Samuel Ramani teaches politics and international relations at Oxford. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute Defense think tank. He's also the author of Russia in Africa, looking at Moscow's post-Cold War foreign policy in Africa. A very warm welcome to the day. So we've heard there grain exports are top of the minds for African leaders at that summit. Do you think Putin's promises to maintain supplies to Africa will be enough amid these concerns of a global food crisis?
Well, I think it's probably clear that it's not going to be enough. That's why we saw the African Union speak so strongly about ending the war in Ukraine, as well as pushing for an end to some of the secondary consequences, and also aligned sort of sympathetic leaders like Egypt and Sisi calling for similar things. So I don't think that the African leaders are really that convinced by Putin's direct grain transfer or free grain offer.
Yeah. Now, Putin also, it appears, did not get the turnout that he hoped for at this summit. Obviously, there are historical linkages between Africa, thanks to the Soviet Union's support of anti-colonial movements in the 20th century. But can you tell us how much that endures, and is it stronger in certain countries?
Well, it's certainly something that the Russians like to play at the anti-colonial card, and they go back to the Soviet legacy in decolonization. So it was interesting to see that Nikolai Patrushev accused Western countries of trying to pressure African countries not to attend the summit because of neocolonial aspirations. There were discussions that this is some kind of a national liberation movement that's taking place. And even their reaction to the coup in Niger that just unfolded was the end of Francafrique and the liberation of all of West Africa, with Mali and Burkina Faso having been the previous ones. So this is definitely something that does resonate. I think it resonates most strongly in places like South Africa because of the experience of apartheid, Angola because of the long and protracted decolonization process, with Portugal, as well as in some parts of French West Africa.
Yeah. Now, coming out of this summit, we're hearing Russia's also signed a military cooperation agreements with over 40 African countries. That's feeling a lot like the Cold War. Can you tell us how significant you think this development is?
Well, it really depends on what the substance of these individual military technical agreements are, because Russia has already signed 20 countries with military technical agreements from 2015 to 2020. Some of them were simply just MOUs. Some of them offer training of police forces and anti-piracy assistance in the maritime sphere, and some of them actually led to arms deliveries and the deployment of instructors, like we saw in Central African Republic or Mali. So not all military cooperation is created equal. So what will remain to be seen is exactly what unfolds from these agreements in the weeks and months ahead.
Yeah. Now, your book has charted the growth of Moscow's influence in Africa over the past 3 decades. How ideologically aligned do you think African states are with Moscow? Is there a clear link, or is this just a practical matter of where they see the most support?
Well, this is a bit of a practical matter, I think. When you look at opinion polls inside Africa, aside maybe from Mali, with its tightly controlled information space and a deep disdain for France, and Russia seen as the antidote, the vast majority of people in Africa do not approve of the war in Ukraine, for instance. Vladimir Putin's leadership also usually gets low scores in the African continent, has only seen a stature decline over the course of the past year. But Africa also opposes the Western efforts to try to isolate Russia from the international stage. It accepts a lot of Russia's ideas about a multipolar world order, and it wants to play all the major powers off each other. So I think it's mostly pragmatic, but this call for multipolarity and this opposition to sanctions on Russia, I think, is something that might be ideational.
Yeah. Now, it also seems like at this summit we heard a stronger tone from African leaders against Russia than we have previously heard. For which countries is Russia's war against Ukraine the most consequential?
Well, I think it's most consequential, obviously, for countries where there's a severe food insecurity problem. So Somalia obviously was one of the targets of free grain from 5,000 tons to 50,000 tons being delivered. We're also seeing Russia really try to make an outreach towards Ethiopia, including tripling the number of Ethiopian students who could be attending Russian universities, but oddly enough, not offering any kind of grain or agricultural support to Abiy Ahmed's government. So I think would say it's most consequential for countries in the Horn of Africa as well as in North Africa, because countries like Egypt, countries like Libya have a long-standing institutional dependency on Ukrainian grain, and that's really what they'll be concerned about.
And just briefly before I let you go, Russia's inroads on the continent, where does this leave Ukraine's Western backers?
Well, I mean, I think that it just is a wake-up call that Russia still does have considerable clout on the continent, even if only 17 leaders attend. And it's important for the U.S. and the West to take more of a first-mover action on combating Russian disinformation, especially about food insecurity, the war in Ukraine, how NATO provoked this war, and things like this. There was an informational security summit that was occurred at the Russia-Africa Summit, pledged from Putin to create a common information space. And the West should really pay attention to that if they want to win hearts and minds and counter it.
Well, thank you very much for that very enlightening interview. That's Samuel Ramani from the Royal United Services Institute. Appreciate your time. Well, Macharia Munene is Professor of History and International Relations at the United States International University in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you so much for taking the time. Let's start by talking about this proposed peace deal between Russia and Ukraine that these African leaders are pushing for. What more can you tell us about this?
Well, it's an effort to broker peace and to be seen to be players in the international arena. It gives Russia an opportunity to appear to be reasonable. And if it considers and then puts the owners on the other side, if it fails to respond in a positive way. So it's a way that would make the African team players, but also ease the tensions and the problem with getting some resources that are needed. So it's a political play at the global level, and it plays right into Russia's interest.
Yeah, let's turn to that because it seemed pretty clear from this meeting that one of the things African leaders were most keen to see was assurances that grain will continue to reach their countries to be able to feed their populations. We know Russia recently pulled out of the Black Sea deal that allowed Ukraine to ship its grain to the world. Putin now promising African leaders to send its own grain for free to 6 countries. But do you think that that will be enough?
No, it's not. It's a start, but it's not quite enough. And because it's promising to about 6 countries, the whole issue of food shortage in Africa cannot be solved with one stroke like that. And there are a number of countries that would like to get a little more. They are not going to get all of it, but it's a start. And it also makes Putin look very good as a person who is reasonable and is worried about the problems that other people have, in part because of his engagement in Ukraine. Whether one is right or wrong,
I'm sorry to jump in and interrupt, but does it seem reasonable if what Putin is offering is not, in fact, what these African leaders want, if it's not enough? And we know that he was the one who pulled Russia out of this deal with Ukraine to ensure that they would get the grain they need. Is there consensus among African leaders here? It seems like not everybody attended this meeting.
No, not everybody attended the meeting. There's always reservations in some quarters. Putin pulled out of the deal for whatever reason that was. And it has a devastating effect across the board. And so the Africans saying, look, do a little more than just saying you're going to offer free grain to 6 countries, or to and the rest are left hanging in the air. So the question still comes up, what about the others? How do we ensure that the blockage in the Black Sea does not become a permanent thing, while actually what is needed is an opening for the supply of whatever is needed. More dialogue, more discussions, more agreement on which way to go is needed. And no one can say that it is an opening that makes Russia look good.
Yeah. How likely, though, do you think Russia is to really entertain this peace deal? It's been brought before him weeks ago already, and he said he will consider it. But the fact that they have not come out after this summit to say that he's taking it seriously and has agreed to it, does that tell you something? I wonder why African leaders would go to this summit if he was not going to agree.
Well, he's indicated that he will listen, because it also depends on the other side, on the Ukrainian side, whether it is also willing to consider the deal. So it is, the proposal. It's a two-way traffic. So what Russia has done is to say we shall consider on our part, and that puts the onus on the Ukrainian side whether it will consider the proposal. And if the two sides consider the proposal, then the African team will be making some headway. Right now, it's a one-sided thing. So they need also to push the same proposal to the Ukrainians. And if the Ukrainians agree, then they'll be making some progress.
I don't think the Ukrainians would necessarily agree with that. But thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us on DW. That's Masharia Munene, Professor of History and International Relations.
Thank you.